Late yesterday, investigators swarming Nancy Guthrie's home in a renewed search for clues in the disappearance of Savannah's mom. The multi-agency team, including FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, and a Border Patrol canine unit, entering the property behind new yellow crime scene tape. It's the first time we've seen this type of activity since the 84-year-old went missing.
2 a.m. A medical device stopped transmitting data. No alarm, no warning, just a gap in the digital record. By sunrise, an 84-year-old woman was missing from her home. Investigators found signs of forced entry. A security device had been removed, and her essential medications were left behind. This is a true crime documentary about a case that has law enforcement, federal agencies, and millions of people asking, what happened to Nancy Guthrie? Nancy didn't leave on her own. She had limited mobility and couldn't travel far without assistance. She didn't forget where she was. Her cognitive function was intact. She didn't leave voluntarily. Her phone, wallet, and vehicle remained at the scene. Someone entered her home, and investigators believe they knew what they were doing. Within 48 hours, communications claiming to be ransom demands were sent to media outlets. Unverified messages referenced specific details about the case, but authorities have not confirmed their authenticity. And critically, no verified proof of life has been provided. Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, NBC's Today Show co-anchor. The case has drawn national attention due to the family's public profile and the unusual circumstances surrounding the disappearance. The investigation is examining multiple angles: individuals with knowledge of her routine, service providers with property access, community connections, and the proximity to the U.S. Mexico border an area with documented organized crime activity. But the evidence suggests something deliberate. A security device was disabled. The timeline of the incident occurred during overnight hours when detection was less likely, and investigators are analyzing forensic evidence from the scene. There's also a medical urgency. Nancy requires daily cardiac medication. Without it, her condition could deteriorate rapidly. Law enforcement has stated publicly, time is critical. So where is she? What happened that night? And who is responsible? This case involves a high-profile family, unverified communications, forensic evidence, and a vulnerable individual at the center of an active federal investigation. This is the story of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, a case where investigators are following leads, but answers remain elusive, where every hour matters, and where the public is being asked to come forward with information. If you want the facts, the timeline, the evidence, the investigative angles, and the questions law enforcement is working to answer, stay with me. Because what happened in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, in Tucson, Arizona, is a case that demands attention. Hit subscribe to follow this investigation. To everyone already here, thank you for helping keep this case visible. Let's find the answers. Nancy Guthrie lived in the Catalina foothills, an upscale residential area north of Tucson where desert landscape meets mountain terrain. Her home sat near East Skyline Drive and North Campbell Avenue, a neighborhood known for its quiet streets and proximity to hiking trails. She was 84 years old, standing about 5'5", approximately 150 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes. Physically, she faced challenges. Her mobility was limited. She couldn't walk more than 50 yards without assistance. She relied on a pacemaker to regulate her heart rhythm and took daily medication for cardiac conditions, including high blood pressure. Missing even one day of medication posed serious health risks. But mentally, Nancy was sharp. No dementia, no confusion. She managed her own affairs and maintained an active social life within her capabilities. Nancy was a woman of deep faith. She attended church regularly, a fixture in her congregation for over 3 decades. Her routine was predictable: Sunday services without fail, Saturday family dinners, weekly visits from household staff who helped with cleaning, pool maintenance, and landscaping. She lived alone but stayed connected. Her late husband had passed years earlier, leaving her to raise 3 children largely on her own. Savannah, the youngest, became co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. Charles Cameron served as a retired F-16 pilot. Annie worked as a writer and poet, living nearby in Tucson. The siblings remained close, frequently visiting their mother and including her in family events. Nancy had even appeared on Today with Savannah and Annie in November 2025 during a hometown segment, showcasing the family's tight bond. Saturday, January 31st, 2026, started like any other weekend. Nancy had dinner with family members that evening. Around 9:30 to 9:45 p.m., relatives dropped her off at home. According to Sheriff Chris Nanos of Pima County, Annie Guthrie was among those who brought Nancy back, helping her inside safely. Annie later told authorities that nothing seemed unusual that evening. Nancy appeared fine, showed no signs of distress, and settled in for the night. Reports indicate that Annie's husband, Tommaso Cioni, was also present during the drop-off. That was the last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie. Sunday morning, February 1st, Nancy didn't show up at church. For a woman who attended services as reliably as clockwork, this absence immediately raised concerns. A church friend or member noticed she was missing and reached out to the family. Relatives responded quickly, heading to Nancy's home to check on her. They searched the house and property for nearly an hour. Nothing. No sign of Nancy. No indication of where she might have gone. Around noon, they called 911 to report her missing. Pima County Sheriff's deputies arrived, and what they found transformed a welfare check into a criminal investigation. The scene showed signs of forced entry. There was forensic evidence inside the home that matched Nancy's DNA. Small amounts were found inside the residence, with traces leading toward the front door and onto the porch. At least one Ring security camera had been removed or tampered with, leaving an empty bracket where the device should have been. Nancy's phone, wallet, and car were all still at the residence. Her medications sat untouched on the counter. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Nancy had been taken against her will. Sheriff Nanos held a news conference on Monday, February 2nd. He didn't mince words. Nancy Guthrie was believed to have been abducted, possibly during the overnight hours or early morning of February 1st. The urgency was compounded by her medical needs. She required her cardiac medication every 24 hours. Without it, her condition could become life-threatening. The sheriff stressed that time was critical and every hour mattered. The search effort ramped up immediately. Drones swept overhead. Helicopters scanned the rugged desert terrain surrounding the Catalina foothills. K-9 units tracked scents across the property and into the surrounding area. Ground teams, including volunteers from the community, combed through the desert landscape. Border Patrol agents assisted given the proximity to the U.S.-Mexico border, less than 60 miles south. Despite the extensive effort, no trace of Nancy was found. The focus began shifting from a wilderness search to a criminal investigation centered on who took her and why. By Tuesday, February 3rd, the FBI's Tucson field office formally joined the investigation. Federal agents began analyzing cell tower data, looking for any pings from devices that might have been in the area during the critical window. They conducted interviews with family members, neighbors, household staff, and anyone who had recent contact with Nancy. Over 100 tips poured into 88 Crime, a local tip line, with a reward of up to $2,500 offered for information leading to an arrest. Forensic analysis confirmed that the biological evidence found at the scene matched Nancy's DNA, but no suspect had been identified. Investigators were also working with the manufacturer of Nancy's pacemaker to retrieve any data that might indicate when the device stopped syncing with her Apple Watch and iPhone. Sources close to the investigation indicated the pacemaker stopped transmitting data around 2 a.m. on Sunday, February 1st. Since her devices remained at the home, the most likely explanation was that Nancy had been moved out of Bluetooth range, taken away in a vehicle, or otherwise removed from the property. Then came the communications. Multiple media outlets, including TMZ and local Tucson stations like KOLD and KGUN, received messages purporting to be from whoever took Nancy. The messages demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin, sent to specific cryptocurrency wallet addresses. At least one communication included details about what Nancy had been wearing on Saturday night: gray slacks and a white blouse, along with specifics about the condition of her home. These were details that only someone with direct knowledge of the scene or close access to early reports would know. Sheriff Nanos acknowledged the communications during his Tuesday briefing. He confirmed that authorities were aware of them, taking them seriously, and sharing all information with the FBI. However, he would not confirm whether the messages were authentic or whether they contained accurate details. The FBI was leading the digital forensics effort, tracing email origins, IP addresses, and blockchain transactions to determine if any payments had been attempted. Family members were urged not to engage independently with any communications. The lack of proof of life became a critical issue. In genuine abduction cases, perpetrators typically provide some form of verification that the victim is alive: a recent photograph with a timestamp, a voice recording, a personal item only the victim would have. None of that materialized publicly in Nancy's case. No video, no photo, no new details that would confirm she was alive after the abduction. This absence raised questions about whether the communications were legitimate demands from actual abductors or opportunistic hoaxes from individuals exploiting the high-profile nature of the case. Savannah Guthrie traveled to Tucson immediately upon learning of her mother's disappearance. She stepped back from her duties at Today and cancelled plans to cover the upcoming Olympics. On February 4th, Savannah posted a heartfelt message on social media, standing alongside her siblings, Annie and Charles Cameron. In a video that quickly went viral, Savannah addressed her mother directly. "Mama, if you're listening, we need you to come home," she said, her voice breaking. She also addressed whoever might be holding her mother, asking for proof that Nancy was alive and safe. The family expressed their willingness to listen and cooperate. The video was raw, emotional, and deeply personal, offering a glimpse into the anguish the family was experiencing. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors expressed shock and fear. Vigils were organized at local churches, including one at St. Philip's in the Hills Episcopal Church. Nancy's home congregation rallied around the family, offering prayers and support. Online, the reaction was intense. Social media platforms filled with comments ranging from heartfelt prayers to angry demands for justice. Hashtags like #BringNancyHome began trending locally. People shared tips on elderly safety, discussed home security measures, and debated the various theories emerging about what might have happened. And theories there were plenty. The speculation began almost immediately, fueled by the unusual circumstances and the high-profile nature of the victim's family. Some focused on those closest to Nancy. Annie and Tommaso Cioni were the last people confirmed to have seen her alive. Online commenters questioned whether they knew more than they were saying, whether they had knowledge of the home's security setup, whether financial motives like inheritance might be at play. But Sheriff Nanos and the FBI made clear that no suspects had been named, no persons of interest identified, and no evidence pointed toward family involvement. The FBI visited Annie's home on Tuesday as part of standard investigative protocol, interviewing close relatives and checking timelines. No arrests were made, no charges suggested. Others pointed to household staff. Nancy employed people for housekeeping, pool maintenance, and landscaping. These individuals had regular access to her home, knew her schedule, understood the layout, and were familiar with her security measures. Sheriff Nanos confirmed in an interview with the Arizona Daily Star that investigators had located and interviewed most of the people who worked for Nancy. They were checking alibis and gathering information. Again, no one was publicly identified as a suspect, but the fact that household staff were interviewed early indicated that access and familiarity were key investigative angles. The church community also came under scrutiny, though more gently. Nancy's attendance at services was so regular that her absence triggered the initial alarm. Members of her congregation knew her schedule, her habits, her vulnerabilities. In tight-knit faith communities, information flows freely. Someone could have tracked when she was home alone, when she was most vulnerable. However, the overwhelming response from the church was one of support, not suspicion. Pastors and congregants expressed love for Nancy and organized prayer vigils. There was no public indication that investigators were focusing on church connections as a primary angle. The proximity to the U.S.-Mexico border introduced another layer of speculation. The Catalina foothills sit less than 60 miles from the international boundary, an area known for migrant crossings, smuggling routes, and cartel activity. Groups like the Sinaloa Cartel and Jalisco New Generation Cartel operate in the region, known for kidnappings and extortion schemes. The demand for Bitcoin in the unverified communications fit a pattern seen in some cross-border criminal operations. Cartels have increasingly used cryptocurrency to evade financial tracking. A 2024 DEA report noted a rise in Bitcoin-based ransom demands in border abductions. If the communications were genuine, they suggested a level of sophistication and planning consistent with organized crime. However, no evidence publicly linked the case to cartel activity. Border Patrol assisted in the search efforts, using their resources and knowledge of the terrain, but their involvement was standard given the geography, not an indication of confirmed cartel involvement. Some online commenters went further, weaving conspiracy theories involving national figures. Savannah Guthrie had interviewed Virginia Giuffre, a victim of Jeffrey Epstein, on Today in 2019. The interview probed deeply into Epstein's trafficking network and the powerful individuals connected to it. A few speculators suggested that Nancy's abduction could be retaliation or an attempt to silence or intimidate Savannah. However, this theory lacked any evidentiary support. Epstein died in 2019, and while his network's reach was extensive, no credible link connected his associates to Nancy's disappearance. Law enforcement made no public statements suggesting such a connection, and the theory remained confined to the fringes of online speculation. What remained undeniable was the forensic evidence. The scene at Nancy's home told a story of deliberate action. The removal of the security camera suggested premeditation. Whoever entered the home knew the camera was there and took steps to disable it, avoiding digital evidence of their presence. The timing of the incident, between approximately 9:45 p.m. on Saturday and 2 a.m. on Sunday, aligned with the quietest hours in a residential neighborhood. Fewer witnesses, less traffic, lower likelihood of detection. The pacemaker data provided a narrow window. If the device stopped syncing around 2 a.m., that suggested Nancy was moved out of range at that time, likely placed in a vehicle and driven away. The forensic evidence found at the scene indicated some level of struggle or injury, though the exact nature and extent were not publicly disclosed to protect the integrity of the investigation. Sheriff Nanos and the FBI faced a challenging balance. They needed public assistance, tips, sightings, any information that could break the case open, but they also needed to withhold certain details to filter out false leads and protect investigative strategies. The result was a steady stream of carefully worded press conferences that confirmed some facts while leaving critical questions unanswered. Who took Nancy? Was it one person or multiple perpetrators? Was this a targeted abduction because of Savannah's public profile, or was Nancy a random victim chosen for her vulnerability and perceived wealth? Were the ransom communications genuine, or were they cruel hoaxes designed to exploit a family in crisis? As of February 4, 2026, Nancy Guthrie had been missing for more than 72 hours. The clock was ticking not just for investigators, but for Nancy herself. Cardiac patients in their 80s can deteriorate rapidly without maintenance medication. Blood pressure can spike. Heart rhythms can become irregular. The risk of stroke, heart attack, or sudden cardiac arrest increases with each passing hour. Sheriff Nanos had been blunt in his public statements. Going without her medication could be fatal. The family's anguish was compounded by the knowledge that even if Nancy was being held somewhere, even if she was physically unharmed by her captors, her own body was working against her. The investigation continued at full intensity. FBI agents worked around the clock analyzing digital evidence, tracing communications, and following up on every tip that came through the hotline. Pima County Sheriff's deputies re-canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, reviewing security footage from nearby homes, checking license plate reader data for any vehicles that passed through the area during the critical window. Forensic specialists processed evidence from the scene, looking for fingerprints, DNA from anyone other than Nancy, fibers, or any trace evidence that might identify the perpetrator. The pacemaker manufacturer cooperated with investigators, providing technical data about the device's last known activity. Cell tower records were subpoenaed to identify any phones that pinged in the area during the overnight hours. The public remained engaged, but the emotional toll was evident. Comments on social media reflected a mix of hope, anger, fear, and frustration. People prayed for Nancy's safe return. They expressed outrage at the violation of an elderly woman's home and safety. They debated the merits of various theories, sometimes crossing into speculation that bordered on accusation. Law enforcement repeatedly urged restraint, reminding the public that unverified theories could harm the investigation and the family. False leads clogged tip lines. Accusations against innocent individuals caused real harm. The balance between public engagement and responsible reporting was delicate. Media outlets faced their own ethical dilemmas. TMZ's decision to publish details about the unverified Ransom communications drew criticism. Some argued that publicizing the demands could interfere with negotiations or encourage copycats. Others felt that transparency was important, that the public had a right to know what was happening in a case of such high interest. Local Tucson stations walked a finer line, reporting on the communications while emphasizing that their authenticity had not been confirmed. Savannah Guthrie's colleagues at NBC expressed support for the family while maintaining journalistic standards in their coverage. The case became a test of how media handles high-profile disappearances involving one of their own. Nancy Guthrie's story resonated beyond Tucson. It touched on fears that many families face: the vulnerability of aging parents living alone, the balance between independence and safety, the unpredictability of violence, even in quiet neighborhoods. It raised questions about home security, about the effectiveness of devices like Ring cameras when a determined perpetrator can simply remove them, about the limitations of medical monitoring devices when someone is forcibly taken out of range. It highlighted the challenges law enforcement faces in cases where time is critical but evidence is limited. The case also underscored the double-edged nature of public profiles. Savannah Guthrie's visibility brought national attention to her mother's disappearance, generating tips and keeping pressure on investigators. But it also raised the possibility that Nancy was targeted precisely because of that visibility, that someone saw an opportunity to exploit a high-profile family for financial gain or other motives. The family found themselves navigating an impossible situation, needing public help while also being subjected to public scrutiny and speculation. As the investigation entered its fourth day, the unknowns still outnumbered the knowns. Investigators knew Nancy had been taken against her will. They knew the approximate time frame. They knew she required medication urgently. They knew communications claiming to be ransom demands had been sent to media outlets, but they didn't know who took her. They didn't know where she was. They didn't know if she was alive. They didn't know if the ransom communications were genuine or hoaxes. They didn't know the motive. Every lead was being pursued, every tip evaluated, every piece of evidence analyzed, but answers remained elusive. The Guthrie family waited. Savannah, Annie, and Charles stayed in Tucson, close to the investigation, available to law enforcement, holding on to hope while bracing for the worst. They released statements thanking the community for prayers and support. They urged anyone with information to come forward. They asked for privacy, while also recognizing that public attention might be the key to bringing their mother home. The emotional toll was visible in every public appearance, every statement, every plea. Nancy Guthrie remained missing. The search continued. The investigation pressed forward, and the clock kept ticking. The investigation intensified as federal resources poured into Tucson. By February 5th, the FBI had established a command post near the Pima County Sheriff's Department headquarters, coordinating efforts between local, state, and federal agencies. Special agents from the FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children unit arrived from Quantico, bringing expertise in abduction cases and behavioral analysis. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Persons offered technical assistance, though Nancy's age placed her outside their typical mandate. The case was being treated with the urgency typically reserved for child abductions, driven by her medical vulnerability and the evidence suggesting foul play. President Donald Trump weighed in on February 6th during a press briefing at the White House. Asked about the case by reporters, he expressed sympathy for the Guthrie family and pledged federal support. "We're doing everything we can," Trump stated. "The FBI is all over this. We're going to find out what happened." The presidential attention brought additional scrutiny and resources. Kash Patel, serving in a senior advisory role, visited Tucson on February 7th to meet with investigators and assess the federal response. His presence signaled the administration's commitment, but also added political dimensions to an already complex case. Critics questioned whether the response would have been as robust if the victim's daughter wasn't a prominent media figure. Supporters argued that any tool available should be used to find a missing elderly woman whose life was in danger. The reward money climbed steadily. The FBI increased their contribution to $50,000 on February 6th, bringing the total reward to over $75,000 when combined with local contributions from 88 crime and private donors. Digital billboards across southern Arizona displayed Nancy's photograph and description, urging anyone with information to call the FBI tip line. The number 1-800-CALLFB appeared on highway signs, gas station screens, and social media feeds. Tips continued flowing in, though the quality varied wildly. Some callers reported seeing elderly women matching Nancy's description in various locations across Arizona, New Mexico, and even northern Mexico. Each sighting required follow-up, consuming investigative resources even when they led nowhere. Forensic analysis of the scene yielded additional details, though many remained classified. Sources close to the investigation, speaking on condition of anonymity, indicated that the biological evidence found inside Nancy's home suggested she had been injured during the abduction. The pattern and location of the evidence pointed to a struggle near the front entrance, consistent with someone being forcibly removed from the residence. However, Sheriff Nanos refused to characterize the severity of any injury, stating only that Nancy required immediate medical attention beyond her cardiac medication needs. This careful language suggested investigators knew more than they were sharing, likely to preserve details that only the perpetrator would know. The ring camera removal became a focal point of investigative analysis. Detectives determined that the device had been physically detached from its mounting bracket sometime between 10 p.m. on Saturday and 2 a.m. on Sunday. The camera's last recorded footage showed nothing unusual, just the quiet street and Nancy's front porch in the evening darkness. Whoever removed it either knew exactly where it was positioned or conducted reconnaissance beforehand. The bracket remained attached to the wall, indicating the camera was pulled off rather than unscrewed, suggesting urgency or lack of tools. Investigators checked with Ring's parent company, Amazon, to determine if the device had transmitted any final images or alerts before going offline. The company cooperated fully, providing technical data and access logs, but the camera had simply stopped recording when physically disconnected. No final image of the perpetrator existed. Neighborhood canvassing produced mixed results. Several residents reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area during the days leading up to Nancy's disappearance. One neighbor recalled a dark-colored SUV, possibly a Chevrolet Suburban or similar model, parked on a side street near Nancy's home on Friday afternoon, January 30th. The vehicle had tinted windows and out-of-state plates, though the neighbor couldn't recall which state. Another resident mentioned seeing a white panel van, the kind used by contractors or service companies, driving slowly through the neighborhood on Saturday morning. Neither sighting could be definitively connected to the abduction, but investigators added both vehicles to their search parameters. License plate reader data from nearby intersections was pulled and analyzed, generating a list of every vehicle that passed through the area during the 72 hours before Nancy's disappearance. The list contained hundreds of entries, each requiring verification. The household staff interviews revealed important background information. Nancy employed a housekeeper named Maria, who came twice weekly on Tuesdays and Fridays. Maria had worked for Nancy for over 8 years and was devastated by the disappearance. She told investigators that Nancy was kind, generous, and treated her like family. Maria had a key to the home and knew the security code, but she had been at her own residence in South Tucson on Saturday night, confirmed by her husband and neighbors. A pool maintenance company, Desert Oasis Pool Service, serviced Nancy's pool every Thursday. The technician, a man in his 30s named Robert, had been to the property the Thursday before Nancy disappeared. He was interviewed and cleared after providing receipts, GPS data from his service vehicle, and an alibi for Saturday night. A landscaping crew from Green Valley Landscaping handled yard work monthly. The crew had last been to Nancy's property on January 15th, more than 2 weeks before the abduction. All crew members were documented workers with no criminal histories. Each was interviewed and eliminated as suspects. The focus on household staff wasn't about suspicion of direct involvement, but rather about access to information. Anyone who worked at Nancy's home regularly would know her schedule, her vulnerabilities, her security setup. They would know she lived alone, that she had limited mobility, that she was the mother of a wealthy and famous daughter. Information like that, even shared innocently in conversation with friends or family, could reach the wrong ears. Investigators explored whether any of the household staff had connections to individuals with criminal backgrounds, whether any had financial troubles that might make them susceptible to offers of money in exchange for information. Nothing concrete emerged, but the investigative angle remained open. Church connections were handled delicately. Nancy's faith community at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church had been a cornerstone of her life for decades. Pastor David Tittle spoke publicly about Nancy's dedication, her kindness, her quiet generosity. She had volunteered in various capacities over the years, helped organize fundraisers, participated in Bible study groups, and mentored younger members. The congregation knew her well, and many had her phone number, knew where she lived, understood her routine. Investigators attended services on Sunday, February 8th, observing and speaking informally with congregants. They were looking for anything unusual. Someone asking too many questions about Nancy in the weeks before her disappearance, someone showing excessive interest in her family, anyone who seemed out of place or overly curious about the investigation. Nothing raised immediate red flags, but detectives collected names and contact information for follow-up interviews. St. Philip's in the Hills Episcopal Church, where a vigil was held, also cooperated fully with investigators. Though Nancy wasn't a member there, the church opened its doors to the community for prayer gatherings. The vigil on February 5th drew over 300 people, a mix of Nancy's friends, concerned neighbors, and strangers moved by the case. Candles were lit, prayers were offered. Savannah, Annie, and Charles attended, standing together at the front of the sanctuary, their grief visible but their composure intact. Savannah spoke briefly, thanking everyone for their support and asking for continued prayers. The event was covered by local media, and footage of the family's anguish circulated widely online, keeping public attention focused on the case. The Ransom communications remained a puzzle. By February 7th, at least 4 separate messages had been sent to various media outlets and, according to unconfirmed reports, directly to members of the Guthrie family. The demands varied slightly in wording but consistently requested payment in Bitcoin, with amounts ranging from $3 million to $6 million. The messages included specific cryptocurrency wallet addresses where payments should be sent. FBI cyber specialists traced the wallet addresses, finding that they had been created recently and showed no prior transaction history. This suggested they were set up specifically for this case, rather than being part of an established criminal operation. The emails themselves were sent through encrypted services designed to mask the sender's identity and location. Preliminary analysis indicated the messages originated from IP addresses associated with VPN services, making geographic tracing nearly impossible without cooperation from the VPN providers, many of which were based overseas and had policies against cooperating with U.S. law enforcement. Harvey Levin, founder of TMZ, made a controversial statement on February 8th during an appearance on a cable news program. He claimed that TMZ had received a ransom message containing details about Nancy's condition that had not been made public, suggesting the sender had genuine knowledge of her whereabouts. Levin refused to disclose the specific details, citing advice from the FBI, but his comments sparked intense speculation. Was Nancy alive? Was she injured? Was she being held in Arizona, or had she been transported across state lines or international borders? The FBI declined to comment on Levin's statements, and Sheriff Nanos expressed frustration during a press conference, stating that media outlets should coordinate with law enforcement before publicizing information that could compromise the investigation or endanger Nancy. The cryptocurrency angle presented unique challenges. Bitcoin transactions are recorded on a public blockchain, meaning that if a payment were made to the provided wallet addresses, investigators could track the movement of funds. However, sophisticated criminals use techniques like tumbling or mixing services to obscure the trail, breaking large transactions into smaller ones and routing them through multiple wallets before cashing out. The FBI's cyber division had experience with cryptocurrency investigations, having successfully traced ransom payments in several high-profile cases, but the process was time-consuming and required cooperation from cryptocurrency exchanges. In Nancy's case, no payments had been made to any of the provided wallet addresses, as of February 9th, according to blockchain analysis. This raised questions about whether the family was negotiating privately through other channels or whether they had determined the communications were not credible. The family's public statements carefully avoided any mention of negotiations. Savannah's social media posts focused on appeals for information and expressions of gratitude for community support. Annie remained largely silent publicly, though sources indicated she was working closely with investigators, providing detailed information about her mother's habits, health, and social connections. Charles Cameron, the retired F-16 pilot, took a more active role in coordinating with military contacts who might have resources or expertise useful to the search. His background in the Air Force gave him connections to personnel experienced in search and rescue operations, and he reportedly arranged for additional aerial surveillance using private aircraft equipped with thermal imaging cameras. These flights, conducted over the desert areas surrounding Tucson, searched for any heat signatures that might indicate a person in distress or hidden structures where someone could be held. The medical urgency reached a critical threshold by February 9th. Nancy had been without her cardiac medication for over 8 days. Cardiologists consulted by the FBI provided grim assessments. An 84-year-old woman with Nancy's medical history, hypertension, irregular heart rhythm requiring a pacemaker, and other undisclosed cardiac conditions would likely experience severe symptoms after missing multiple doses. Blood pressure could spike to dangerous levels, increasing the risk of stroke. Heart rhythm abnormalities could worsen, potentially leading to cardiac arrest. Even if Nancy was being held by someone who intended to keep her alive for ransom purposes, the lack of proper medication could prove fatal. The medical experts emphasized that time was not just running out. It had likely already run out for Nancy to be found alive and healthy. The best-case scenario involved finding her quickly and getting her to a hospital for emergency treatment. The worst-case scenario was one that investigators and the family tried not to articulate publicly, but that hung over every press conference and every search effort. Sheriff Chris Nanos faced his own controversy during this period. On February 6th, while the search for Nancy was in full swing, Nanos attended a University of Arizona basketball game. Photographs of him at the game, smiling and apparently relaxed, circulated on social media, drawing sharp criticism. Online commenters accused him of not taking the case seriously, of prioritizing entertainment over a life-or-death investigation. Nanos responded defensively during a February 7th press conference, stating that he had been working around the clock on the case and that attending a 2-hour basketball game did not diminish his commitment. He pointed out that he couldn't personally be in the field 24 hours a day and that his department had dozens of deputies and detectives actively working the case. The controversy highlighted the intense scrutiny that high-profile cases bring to law enforcement officials, where every action is analyzed and criticized. The political dimensions of the case continued to evolve. Some conservative commentators used Nancy's disappearance to highlight border security issues, arguing that the proximity to Mexico and the possibility of cartel involvement demonstrated the need for stronger immigration enforcement and border barriers. Progressive voices countered that there was no evidence linking the case to border issues and that politicizing a family's tragedy was inappropriate. Savannah Guthrie's role as a prominent journalist added another layer. Her interviews over the years had covered controversial topics and powerful figures. Some speculated whether her work had made her or her family targets. Others dismissed such theories as conspiracy thinking. The FBI maintained that the investigation was following evidence, not speculation, and that all credible leads were being pursued, regardless of political implications. On February 8th, a significant development occurred. A man in California was arrested for allegedly sending one of the ransom messages. The arrest was made by FBI agents in Los Angeles after cyber specialists traced an email to an IP address associated with the suspect's residence. The man, whose name was not immediately released, was described as having no apparent connection to Nancy Guthrie or her family. Initial reports suggested he might have been attempting to exploit the case for financial gain, sending a fake ransom demand in hopes that the family would pay out of desperation. The arrest was announced by the FBI's Los Angeles field office, which coordinated with the Tucson office. However, officials emphasized that the arrest did not mean Nancy had been found or that the case was solved. It was possible that multiple individuals had sent fake ransom messages, and investigators were still working to determine which, if any, communications were genuine. The California arrest provided a grim reminder of how high-profile cases attract opportunists. In the digital age, anyone with basic technical skills can send anonymous messages, create cryptocurrency wallets, and attempt to extort families in crisis. Law enforcement agencies regularly deal with false leads and hoax communications in missing person cases, particularly those that receive significant media attention. Each fake message consumes investigative resources, diverts attention from genuine leads, and causes additional emotional harm to families already in anguish. The FBI warned that anyone sending false information or attempting to extort the Guthrie family would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, facing potential charges including wire fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice. The search efforts expanded geographically. While initial efforts focused on the immediate area around Nancy's home and the surrounding desert, investigators began looking further afield. The theory that Nancy might have been transported across state lines or into Mexico gained traction. If the abduction was financially motivated, moving her out of Arizona would complicate law enforcement efforts and provide the perpetrators with more leverage. The FBI coordinated with Mexican authorities, sharing information and requesting assistance in monitoring border crossings and checking hospitals or clinics where an elderly American woman might have been brought for medical treatment. Mexican federal police and state authorities in Sonora, the Mexican state directly south of Arizona, were briefed on the case and provided with Nancy's description and photograph. Customs and Border Protection reviewed records of all border crossings in the days following Nancy's disappearance. Agents checked vehicle manifests, pedestrian crossings, and even remote areas where illegal crossings typically occur. No records indicated that Nancy had crossed legally, but the porous nature of the border meant that illegal crossings were always possible. Smugglers move people and goods across the border daily, using established routes through the desert, tunnels, and other methods. If Nancy had been taken into Mexico, finding her would become exponentially more difficult. The FBI's legal attaché in Mexico City worked with Mexican counterparts to coordinate search efforts, but the challenges were immense. Mexico's vast territory, the presence of powerful criminal organizations, and jurisdictional complexities all complicated the effort. Back in Tucson, investigators pursued another angle: financial records. Detectives obtained warrants for Nancy's bank accounts, credit cards, and financial statements, looking for any unusual transactions or patterns that might provide clues. They found nothing suspicious. Nancy's finances were straightforward: Social Security income, pension payments from her late husband's military service, and modest investment returns. She lived comfortably but not extravagantly. There were no large withdrawals, no unusual purchases, no signs of financial distress that might suggest she was being blackmailed or extorted before her disappearance. Her will and estate planning documents were reviewed. She had a standard will leaving her assets to her 3 children equally. There were no unusual provisions, no recent changes, nothing that suggested family conflict over money. Investigators also looked into Savannah Guthrie's finances, not because she was a suspect, but to determine if she had been targeted because of her wealth. As co-anchor of Today, Savannah earned a substantial salary, reportedly in the millions annually. Her public profile and financial success could have made her family a target for criminals who assumed she would pay any amount to get her mother back. However, there was no evidence that Savannah had been contacted directly with ransom demands, at least not through channels that investigators could verify. The family maintained that they were cooperating fully with law enforcement and following FBI guidance on how to handle any communications they received. The pacemaker data continued to be a critical piece of evidence. Medical device manufacturers like Medtronic and Abbott produce pacemakers that sync with smartphones and transmit data to healthcare providers for remote monitoring. Nancy's pacemaker was one such device, connected to her iPhone via Bluetooth and configured to send data to her cardiologist's office. The device recorded heart rate, rhythm, and other vital signs, uploading the information periodically. Investigators worked with the manufacturer to retrieve every piece of data the device had recorded. The last successful data transmission occurred at approximately 1:47 a.m. on February 1st. After that, the device continued recording internally but could not transmit because it was out of range of Nancy's iPhone. This meant that if the pacemaker was still functioning, It contained a record of Nancy's heart activity from 1:47 a.m. onward, stored in the device's internal memory. If Nancy was found, or if the pacemaker was recovered, that data could provide crucial information about what happened to her, whether she experienced cardiac distress, whether she was subjected to physical exertion or trauma, and potentially even whether she was still alive. The possibility that Nancy had died shortly after being taken was one that investigators had to consider, even as they continued to search for her alive. The combination of her medical vulnerability, the evidence of injury at the scene, and the lack of verified proof of life all pointed to the grim possibility that the abduction had gone wrong, that Nancy had been harmed more seriously than intended, or that she had succumbed to her medical conditions. If that were the case, the investigation would shift from a rescue operation to a recovery and homicide investigation. Detectives prepared for that possibility, consulting with the Pima County Medical Examiner's Office and ensuring that resources were in place to process a crime scene if Nancy's body was found. Search teams continued combing the desert. The Sonoran Desert surrounding Tucson is vast and unforgiving. Temperatures in early February were mild, with daytime highs in the 60s and 70s, but nighttime temperatures could drop into the 40s. The terrain is rugged, filled with saguaro cacti, rocky outcroppings, dry washes, and wildlife. Mountain lions, coyotes, and javelinas roam the area. Rattlesnakes, though less active in winter, still pose a danger. Volunteers join professional search teams, walking grid patterns through the desert, looking for any sign of Nancy clothing, personal items, or worse. Cadaver dogs were brought in, trained to detect human remains. The dogs searched areas identified as statistically likely based on criminal behavior patterns, remote locations accessible by vehicle, areas near hiking trails where a body could be concealed, and regions close to water sources. On February 9th, a search team focused on a property several miles from Nancy's home. The property, a large ranch-style estate with outbuildings and a septic system, had been flagged because of a tip called into 88 Crime. The tipster, who remained anonymous, claimed to have seen suspicious activity at the property on the night of Nancy's disappearance, vehicles coming and going at odd hours, lights on in buildings that were normally dark. Deputies obtained a search warrant and arrived at the property with a full team, including K-9 units and forensic specialists. The property owner, an elderly man who lived alone, cooperated fully, allowing investigators to search the main house, a guest house, a barn, and other structures. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the septic tank, a grim but necessary step given the tip's specificity. The search lasted several hours. Nothing was found. No sign of Nancy. No evidence of foul play. The tip, like so many others, led nowhere. Annie Guthrie's home was also searched on February 9th, though the circumstances were different. This was not a raid or a forced entry, but a consensual search conducted with Annie's full cooperation. Investigators wanted to eliminate any possibility that evidence related to Nancy's disappearance might be at Annie's residence, either because Annie had information she hadn't shared or because someone else had placed evidence there to implicate her. The search was thorough but respectful. Detectives went through rooms, checked vehicles, and reviewed digital devices. Again, nothing was found. Annie and her husband Tommaso Cioni were re-interviewed, walking investigators through the events of January 31st in even greater detail. What time did they pick Nancy up for dinner? Where did they eat? What did they talk about? What was Nancy's mood? Did she mention any concerns, any unusual phone calls, any strangers approaching her? The answers remained consistent with previous statements. Nancy had seemed fine, happy to spend time with family, looking forward to church the next day. There was no indication she felt threatened or worried about anything. The investigation's scope was staggering. By February 10th, over 200 interviews had been conducted. Hundreds of hours of security camera footage from businesses and residences near Nancy's home had been reviewed. Cell tower data for thousands of phones that pinged in the area during the critical window had been analyzed. Forensic evidence from the scene was still being processed in FBI labs. Digital forensic specialists were working to trace the Ransom communications. Financial analysts were following money trails. Behavioral analysts were building profiles of potential suspects based on the evidence and the nature of the crime. And yet, despite all this effort, Nancy Guthrie remained missing. The emotional toll on the family was immense. Savannah had been away from her job at Today for over a week, with no clear timeline for when she might return. Her co-anchors and colleagues expressed support, with the show dedicating segments to Nancy's case and urging viewers to come forward with information. Annie struggled with guilt, replaying the night of January 31st over and over, wondering if there was something she had missed, some sign that danger was imminent. Charles Cameron channeled his military training into action, working tirelessly to coordinate search efforts and maintain communication with law enforcement. But beneath the activity was a shared fear that they would never see their mother alive again. The community's response remained strong. Local businesses displayed posters with Nancy's photograph. Churches continued holding prayer services. Social media campaigns kept the case in the public eye. But as days turned into a second week, the initial surge of attention began to wane. News cycles moved on to other stories. The case, while still covered by local media, received less national attention. This is a common pattern in missing person cases: intense initial interest, followed by a gradual decline as time passes without resolution. Law enforcement officials and victim advocates know that maintaining public attention is crucial, as tips often come weeks or even months after a disappearance, when someone finally connects a piece of information they have to the case they've been hearing about. The FBI held a press conference on February 10th, providing an update on the investigation. Special Agent in Charge Michael Schneider, head of the FBI's Tucson field office, spoke alongside Sheriff Nanos. Schneider confirmed that the investigation was active and ongoing, with dozens of agents working the case full-time. He announced that the reward had been increased to $100,000 for information leading to Nancy's location and the arrest of those responsible. He emphasized that the FBI was pursuing all leads, using every resource available, and coordinating with local, state, and federal partners. He also addressed the Ransom communications, confirming that multiple messages had been received and that at least one person had been arrested for sending a false message. He urged anyone with genuine information to come forward and warned that anyone attempting to exploit the case would face serious criminal charges. Sheriff Nanos spoke about the local effort, praising his deputies and the community for their support. He reiterated that Nancy's medical condition made time critical and that every hour mattered. He also addressed criticism of his attendance at the basketball game, stating that he stood by his commitment to the case and that his department was doing everything possible. The press conference ended with a plea from Savannah Guthrie, who stood at the podium with her siblings. Her voice was steady but strained. "We need answers," she said. "We need to know what happened to our mother. If anyone knows anything, please come forward. She needs to come home." The investigation continued into its 11th day with no breakthrough. Detectives re-interviewed key witnesses, hoping that time and reflection might jog memories or reveal details previously overlooked. They revisited the scene at Nancy's home, conducting additional forensic sweeps with new technology. They expanded the search radius, checking abandoned buildings, remote desert locations, and properties with histories of criminal activity. They coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the Southwest, sharing information and requesting assistance in checking locations where Nancy might have been taken. The case had become a test of investigative persistence. In the absence of clear leads or physical evidence pointing to a specific suspect, investigators had to methodically work through every possibility, eliminate dead ends, and follow the evidence wherever it led. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided a profile of the likely perpetrator or perpetrators based on the crime scene and the nature of the abduction. The profile suggested someone with knowledge of Nancy's routine and vulnerabilities, someone comfortable operating at night in a residential area, someone with access to transportation, and possibly a location where Nancy could be held. The profile also suggested that the abduction was likely financially motivated, given the ransom communications, but that the perpetrator might not be a sophisticated criminal, given the mistakes made removing the ring camera but leaving forensic evidence, sending ransom messages that could be traced, failing to provide proof of life. As February 10th drew to a close, Nancy Guthrie had been missing for 10 days. The investigation had consumed thousands of hours of law enforcement time, involved multiple agencies, and generated hundreds of leads. But the fundamental questions remained unanswered. Where was Nancy? Was she alive? Who took her? And why? The search would continue, the investigation would press forward, and the family would wait, hoping for a miracle, but preparing for heartbreak. The second week of Nancy's disappearance brought a shift in investigative strategy. With the immediate search efforts having covered the most likely areas without results, the FBI and Pima County Sheriff's Department began focusing more intensively on digital forensics and behavioral analysis. By February 11th, a specialized team from the FBI's Cyber Action Team had arrived in Tucson, bringing advanced tools for analyzing the Ransom communications and tracing their origins. These specialists worked in a secure facility, examining metadata from the emails, analyzing linguistic patterns in the messages, and attempting to identify any digital fingerprints the sender might have left behind. The linguistic analysis proved particularly interesting. FBI analysts noted that the ransom messages contained grammatical structures and word choices that suggested the writer might not be a native English speaker or was deliberately trying to disguise their identity by using non-standard phrasing. Certain expressions and sentence constructions appeared consistent with Spanish language patterns, though this was far from conclusive. The messages also contained specific details about Nancy's appearance and her home that could only have come from someone who had been inside the residence or had access to information from someone who had. This suggested either direct involvement in the abduction or communication with those responsible. One particular detail in the messages caught investigators' attention. A reference to Nancy's white blouse with pearl buttons was specific enough that it could be verified against what family members remembered her wearing on January 31st. Annie confirmed that her mother had indeed been wearing a white blouse that evening, though she couldn't recall whether it had pearl buttons specifically. Investigators checked Nancy's closet and found several white blouses, some with pearl buttons, some without. The detail was specific, but not so specific that it couldn't have been a lucky guess or information obtained from someone who had seen Nancy that evening. Still, it suggested the message sender had at least some genuine knowledge of the case. The cryptocurrency wallets provided another avenue of investigation. While no payments had been made to the wallet addresses provided in the ransom messages, FBI analysts traced the creation of the wallets to specific cryptocurrency exchanges. Subpoenas were issued to these exchanges, requesting information about the accounts used to create the wallets. Most exchanges require some form of identification to create accounts, though sophisticated users can circumvent these requirements using fake documents or stolen identities. The exchanges, based in various countries with different levels of cooperation with U.S. law enforcement, responded at different speeds. Some provided information within days. Others required diplomatic channels and formal legal assistance requests that could take weeks or months. On February 12th, a potential break emerged from an unexpected source. A hiker in the Catalina State Park, about 15 miles north of Nancy's home, discovered a woman's shoe along a remote trail. The shoe was a beige slip-on style, size 7, consistent with what Nancy might have worn. The hiker, aware of the ongoing search, immediately contacted authorities. A search team was dispatched to the location within hours. K-9 units were brought in to search the surrounding area. The terrain was challenging, steep, rocky, covered with dense vegetation. If Nancy had been brought to this area, either alive or deceased, finding her would be difficult. The search around the shoe discovery site continued for 3 days. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the area. Ground teams worked methodically through the terrain, checking ravines, caves, and areas where a body might be concealed. Cadaver dogs alerted in several locations, but each alert turned out to be animal remains, deer, javelina, or smaller creatures that had died naturally or been killed by predators. The shoe itself was sent to the FBI lab for analysis. Forensic specialists examined it for DNA, fingerprints, and any trace evidence that might connect it to Nancy or provide clues about where it had been. The results came back on February 15th. The shoe contained DNA, but it didn't match Nancy's profile. It belonged to someone else entirely, likely a hiker who had lost it weeks or months earlier. Another dead end. The emotional roller coaster for the Guthrie family was brutal. Each potential lead brought a surge of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. Savannah remained in Tucson, staying at Annie's home, maintaining daily contact with investigators. She had stopped posting on social media, her last message a simple plea for prayers dated February 10th. Friends and colleagues reported that she was struggling, caught between hope and despair, unable to return to normal life, while her mother's fate remained unknown. Charles Cameron continued his coordination efforts, but the strain was visible. Annie, who had been the last family member to see Nancy alive, carried a particular burden of guilt and grief, despite repeated assurances from investigators that she bore no responsibility for what happened. The investigation expanded to examine Nancy's digital footprint more thoroughly. Detectives obtained warrants for her email accounts, social media profiles, and phone records going back 6 months. They were looking for any indication that Nancy had been in contact with someone who might have targeted her, any unusual communications, any signs that she was being watched or followed. Nancy's digital life was modest. She used email primarily to communicate with family and friends, to receive church newsletters, and to manage basic affairs. Her Facebook account was rarely updated, mostly containing family photographs and occasional shares of inspirational quotes or religious content. Her phone records showed regular calls to her children, to friends from church, and to her doctor's offices. Nothing stood out as suspicious. However, one pattern did emerge. In the 3 weeks before her disappearance, Nancy had received several calls from an unknown number with a Tucson area code. The calls were brief, lasting less than a minute each, suggesting they might have been wrong numbers or robocalls. But the frequency, 5 calls over 3 weeks, was enough to warrant investigation. The FBI traced the number to a prepaid cell phone purchased at a convenience store in South Tucson. The store's security footage from the purchase date showed a man in his 30s or 40s, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, paying cash for the phone. The image quality was poor, making facial identification difficult. The phone itself had been used only to call Nancy and had been turned off after the last call on January 28th, 3 days before her disappearance. It hadn't been used since. Investigators attempted to trace the phone's location history through cell tower data, but the phone had been used sparingly and always in different locations around Tucson, suggesting the user was aware of tracking capabilities and took steps to avoid establishing a pattern. This discovery shifted the investigation's focus. The calls suggested premeditation and surveillance. Someone had been contacting Nancy in the weeks before her abduction, possibly testing whether she would answer unknown numbers, possibly trying to establish some form of communication or simply confirming she was home. The timing of the calls, mostly during daytime hours, suggested the caller was checking her availability or routine. Investigators briefed the family on this development, asking if Nancy had mentioned receiving unusual calls. Annie recalled that her mother had mentioned getting a lot of spam calls lately during a conversation in mid-January, but Nancy hadn't seemed concerned or indicated that the calls were threatening. The prepaid phone lead became a priority. Investigators canvassed the area around the convenience store where it was purchased, showing the security footage image to residents and business owners. No one recognized the man. The store clerk who had been working that day couldn't remember the transaction. Specifically, prepaid phones were a common purchase, and the transaction had occurred weeks earlier. Detectives checked for other purchases made around the same time, hoping the buyer might have used a credit card for something else, but the man had apparently paid cash for everything. The FBI's facial recognition team attempted to enhance the security footage image, but the quality was too poor to generate a usable match against databases. On February 16th, Sheriff Nanos held another press conference, this time to address growing public frustration with the lack of progress. He acknowledged that the investigation was challenging, that leads were being pursued, but that no arrests had been made beyond the California man who sent a fake ransom message. He emphasized that the case remained a top priority and that investigators were working around the clock. He also made a direct appeal to the perpetrator or perpetrators, stating that if Nancy was being held, releasing her would be in their best interest, that cooperation could lead to leniency, and that harming her would only result in more severe consequences. The appeal was a standard law enforcement tactic, attempting to create doubt or fear among those involved, hoping that someone might break ranks or make a mistake. The press conference also addressed the medical timeline. Nanos confirmed what medical experts had been saying privately, that Nancy's chances of survival decreased significantly with each passing day without her medication. At 16 days missing, the likelihood that she was alive and healthy was extremely low. However, Nanos emphasized that the investigation was proceeding as a rescue operation until evidence indicated otherwise. He refused to speculate about whether Nancy was alive or deceased, stating only that finding her remained the primary objective. The community response evolved during this period. Initial shock and sympathy began mixing with other emotions, frustration at the lack of answers, fear that a dangerous criminal remained at large, and in some quarters, darker speculation about family involvement. Online forums and social media platforms became breeding grounds for amateur detectives and conspiracy theorists. Some focused obsessively on Annie and Tommaso Cioni, analyzing their public statements for inconsistencies, questioning why they were the last to see Nancy, suggesting financial motives. Others spun elaborate theories involving Savannah's journalism career, claiming the abduction was retaliation for stories she had covered or interviews she had conducted. Still others insisted the case was connected to border cartels, human trafficking networks, or even political conspiracies. Law enforcement repeatedly urged the public to avoid speculation and to focus on providing credible information through official channels. Sheriff Nanos addressed the online theories directly during his February 16th press conference, stating that baseless accusations against family members or others were harmful to the investigation and potentially actionable legally. He emphasized that the family was cooperating fully and that no evidence suggested their involvement. The FBI issued a similar statement, warning that spreading false information about the case could constitute obstruction of justice. Despite these warnings, the online speculation continued. True crime podcasters began covering the case, some responsibly focusing on facts and appeals for information, others sensationalizing details and promoting unfounded theories. YouTube channels dedicated to missing person cases produced videos analyzing every aspect of Nancy's disappearance, some accumulating hundreds of thousands of views. The attention kept the case in the public eye, but also created noise that made it harder for investigators to identify genuine leads among the flood of tips and theories. On February 18th, 3 weeks after Nancy's disappearance, the investigation took another turn. A woman in Nogales, Arizona, a border town about 60 miles south of Tucson, contacted the FBI tip line. She reported that she had seen an elderly woman matching Nancy's description at a medical clinic in Nogales on February 3rd, 2 days after the abduction. The woman had been accompanied by 2 men, one middle-aged and one younger, both Hispanic. The elderly woman appeared disoriented and unwell, and the witness had thought it odd at the time but hadn't connected it to Nancy's case until seeing a news report. The witness provided a description of the men and the clinic's location. FBI agents and Mexican federal police descended on the clinic within hours. The clinic, a small facility that served both Mexican nationals and Americans seeking less expensive medical care, cooperated fully with investigators. Medical records were reviewed. Staff members were interviewed. Security footage was examined. The clinic had indeed treated an elderly American woman on February 3rd, but the woman was not Nancy Guthrie. She was a 79-year-old woman from Green Valley, Arizona, who regularly crossed the border for medical appointments and prescription medications. She was accompanied by her son and grandson, both of whom were interviewed and cleared. The witness, shown photographs of the actual patient, acknowledged that she might have been mistaken. The lead evaporated. This pattern repeated itself multiple times during the 3rd week of the investigation. A reported sighting in Phoenix turned out to be a different elderly woman. A tip about suspicious activity at a property near the border led to the discovery of an illegal marijuana growing operation, but no connection to Nancy. A caller who claimed to have information about the abduction turned out to be mentally ill, confabulating details from news reports. Each lead required investigation, consuming time and resources, but none brought investigators closer to finding Nancy. The forensic evidence from Nancy's home remained the most solid foundation for the investigation. By late February, lab results had confirmed several key facts. The biological evidence found at the scene was definitively Nancy's. The pattern and distribution suggested she had been injured near the front entrance and that there had been some form of struggle or forceful removal. Analysis of the evidence indicated it was relatively fresh, consistent with the timeline of the abduction. No DNA from anyone else was recovered from the primary scene, suggesting the perpetrator or perpetrators wore gloves or were careful not to leave biological evidence. However, a partial fingerprint was recovered from the Ring camera mounting bracket. The print was fragmentary, not sufficient for a definitive match against databases, but it could potentially be used to confirm a suspect's involvement if someone was identified through other means. The Ring camera itself yielded no additional information, The device had been physically removed, and its internal memory contained only footage up to the moment it was disconnected. No final image of the perpetrator existed. The camera's cloud backup had uploaded footage through approximately 9:47 p.m. on January 31st, showing nothing unusual, just the quiet street and Nancy's front porch. After that, nothing. The removal of the camera remained one of the most telling aspects of the crime. It demonstrated premeditation and awareness of security measures. Whoever took Nancy knew the camera was there and took steps to disable it. Investigators also analyzed the timeline more precisely, using multiple data sources. Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing with her iPhone at approximately 1:47 a.m. Her Apple Watch, which she wore regularly, showed its last recorded movement at 1:52 a.m., suggesting she was still moving at that time, either under her own power or being moved by someone else. The watch's heart rate monitor recorded elevated heart rate and irregular rhythm during the period from approximately 1:30 a.m. to 1:52 a.m., consistent with physical exertion, stress, or a medical event. After 1:52 a.m., the watch stopped recording data, either because it was removed, damaged, or moved out of range of her iPhone. This 5-minute window, 1:47 a.m. to 1:52 a.m., became the focus of intense analysis. What happened during those 5 minutes? Was Nancy being forcibly removed from her home? Was she struggling? Was she experiencing a cardiac event brought on by the stress of the abduction? The medical data painted a grim picture. Nancy's heart rate during those final recorded minutes was dangerously elevated, reaching levels that would be concerning even for a healthy young person, let alone an 84-year-old woman with cardiac conditions. The irregular rhythm suggested her heart was under severe stress. Cardiologists consulted by the FBI indicated that such readings could precede a heart attack or stroke, particularly in someone who was frightened, physically struggling, or being subjected to violence. The data couldn't tell investigators whether Nancy had survived beyond 1:52 a.m., but it suggested she was in medical distress during the abduction itself. This information was not shared publicly. The FBI and Sheriff's Department made a strategic decision to withhold the medical data details, both to protect the family from additional anguish and to preserve information that only the perpetrator would know. In suspect interviews, investigators could use knowledge of Nancy's medical distress as a tool, gauging reactions and testing whether someone had genuine knowledge of what happened. By February 20th, the investigation had generated a massive amount of data, but few concrete answers. Over 300 people had been interviewed. Thousands of hours of security footage had been reviewed. Hundreds of tips had been investigated. Forensic evidence had been analyzed. Digital communications had been traced. Search teams had covered hundreds of square miles of desert terrain. And yet Nancy Guthrie remained missing, her fate unknown, her family in agony, and the public demanding answers that investigators couldn't provide. The case had become a test of investigative endurance and public patience. In an era of instant information and rapid resolution of crimes through DNA and digital evidence, Nancy's disappearance was a reminder that some cases resist easy solutions. The absence of witnesses, the lack of clear physical evidence pointing to a specific suspect, and the possibility that Nancy had been transported far from the abduction site all complicated the investigation. Investigators knew that solving the case might require a break, someone coming forward with information, a suspect making a mistake, or evidence emerging from an unexpected source. The Guthrie family, meanwhile, existed in a state of suspended grief. They couldn't mourn Nancy because they didn't know for certain she was dead. They couldn't celebrate hope because the likelihood of finding her alive diminished with each passing day. They existed in limbo, waiting for news that might never come, holding on to faith while confronting the probability of loss. Savannah made the difficult decision to return to New York and resume her duties at Today on February 23rd. The decision was agonizing, but practical considerations and the advice of investigators played a role. There was nothing more she could do in Tucson. The investigation would continue whether she was there or not, and maintaining some semblance of normalcy, staying engaged with work, might provide a necessary distraction from the constant anxiety. Her return to the Today Show was emotional. Her co-anchors welcomed her back with visible compassion. Savannah addressed her mother's disappearance briefly on air, thanking viewers for their support and asking anyone with information to contact the FBI. She didn't discuss details of the case or her family's ordeal. She simply asked for continued prayers and vigilance. Annie remained in Tucson, serving as the family's primary liaison with investigators. Charles Cameron split his time between his own home and Tucson, coordinating with law enforcement and managing practical matters related to Nancy's property and affairs. The family established a private fund to supplement the official reward, bringing the total to $150,000 for information leading to Nancy's location and the arrest of those responsible. They also worked with victim advocacy groups to keep Nancy's case visible, understanding that public attention often wanes, but that visibility can be crucial to generating tips. As February drew to a close, Nancy Guthrie had been missing for 4 weeks. The investigation remained active, but the intensity had necessarily decreased. Investigators couldn't maintain the initial pace indefinitely. Resources had to be allocated to other cases. The command post established in the early days of the investigation was scaled back. The daily press conferences stopped, replaced by weekly updates. The case transitioned from an emergency response to a long-term investigation, one that might take months or years to resolve. But the core team of investigators remained committed. They continued following leads, re-examining evidence, and exploring new investigative angles. They knew that cases sometimes break open months or even years after they go cold, when someone's conscience finally compels them to speak, when a seemingly unrelated arrest leads to unexpected information, or when advances in forensic technology allow old evidence to be analyzed in new ways. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had become more than just a missing person case. It had become a symbol of vulnerability, of the fragility of safety, of the anguish families endure when someone they love vanishes without explanation. It had exposed the limitations of technology, security cameras that can be removed, medical devices that stop transmitting when someone is taken out of range, digital communications that can be anonymized and encrypted. It had demonstrated both the power and the limitations of law enforcement, the massive resources that can be mobilized, the sophisticated techniques that can be employed, but also the fundamental challenge of solving a crime when evidence is scarce and witnesses are absent. The case remained open, the search continued, and somewhere the truth waited to be discovered.